Do y'all remember Marvel Knights? Of course you don't. My fellow comics geeks may be thinking about the seminal imprint from the late 90s, mid 2000s, but I'm talking about the brief run of Marvel Knights films. From 2008 to 2012, only 2 films were released under this banner, Punisher Warzone and Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance. One of those films has grown a small yet fervent cult following, and the other is a movie that sure does exist. So what was Marvel Knights, and what, if anything, was its legacy? Hello, I'm Joe, and today we're diving into the curious case of Marvel Knights. The 2000s represented the dawn of a new era. Once relegated to low-budget schlock, the success of Blade, X-Men, and Spider-Man meant that superhero movies were finally entering the big leagues. Fantastic Four is no longer regulated to some unreleased straight-to-video B-movie. No! We're gonna make it for double the budget and half the quality. For those who weren't there, 2000 to 2007 was essentially the genre's figuring it out phase. And while there were some bangers, the misses were plentiful. I'm talking Daredevil, Elektra, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Hulk, freaking Catwoman. Oof. And even in the franchises that were successful, the third entries tended to be pretty underwhelming, be it X-Men Last Stand, Blade Trinity, or Spider-Man 3, which I still think is a superior Spider-Man 3. I said what I said. The 2 films we're focusing on today actually had predecessors that fell into this weird middle ground. Ghost Rider and The Punisher, released by Sony and Lionsgate respectively, these are both peak mid-2000s superhero movies. The Punisher was an anomaly in that it was one of the few R-rated superhero movies of the era. I remember somehow convincing my mom to letting me go see it in theaters, and 12-year-old me thought that shit went hard. And it may be nostalgia talking, but I think it's still perfectly watchable today. I don't dislike it as much as some folks seem to. The movie got middling reviews, and while it did serviceable at the box office, it was by no means a runaway success. The same can be said for Ghost Rider. Released in 2007, it's one of the last relics of the pre-modern era, and you can just feel it. For better or worse, there wasn't really a set formula on how to make a superhero movie, and more often than not, they kind of felt like really expensive kids' movies. Ghost Rider in particular is an inherently dark, horror-tinged concept, but the movie feels just, kind of silly. There's some cool shots for sure. I mean, Ghost Rider slinging the whip and driving down the side of a building as I got my 14-year-old tail in the seat. But after watching it in theaters, I never really felt a pressing desire to revisit it again. That said, Ghost Rider on the PS2 is actually a pretty solid God of War clone. Both films did well enough to warrant continuations, but not so well that they had to be like straight up hardcore sequels to what came before. A Punisher 2 was on track to be made. While its box office was just decent, it made up for it in strong DVD sales. Production on Punisher 2 was set to begin in 2007, at least until OG Punisher Thomas Jane pulled out due to the lack of a solid script. And for those about to say Dolph Lundgren was the OG Punisher. Really? Really? Like The Punisher, a sequel to Ghost Rider was announced shortly after the financial success of the first film. Yet, as time went on, it was clear that Ghost Rider 2 wasn't going to be a straight-up sequel to the first film. Taking place 8 years after the events of the first movie, the film didn't retcon anything from Ghost Rider, but it also didn't pay off or continue any of the plot threads established in the first movie. So now that we've established a little bit of context, let's get into what Marvel Knights was. Now, in comics, the Marvel Knights brand has a strong, proud legacy. In the early 2000s, Marvel was fighting for survival after filing for bankruptcy in 1998. In an effort to lure in new readers, it launched 3 new imprints: Max, Ultimate Comics, and Marvel Knights. Now, Max were explicitly adult-centric comics. For me, this was basically my equivalent of discovering a Playboy for the first time. I didn't know what Punisher Max was when I was flipping through it in the comic book store, but ya boy learned. These books had nudity, hyperviolence, and were essentially the equivalents of an early 2000s HBO show. Ultimate Comics was an effort to lure in new readers by rebooting the timeline for some of its most popular characters. And this worked like gangbusters. I personally think one of the most brilliant things they did was include a copy of Ultimate Spider-Man #1 for audiences who happened to go see the original Spider-Man movie. My lifelong love of reading comics largely stemmed from getting that Ultimate Spider-Man #1 when I went to go see Spider-Man as an 8-year-old. Lastly, there's Marvel Knights. While Max was explicitly an adult-focused affair, and Ultimate Comics was all ages tilting towards PG-13, Marvel Knights fell somewhere in the middle. It was a bit more mature, but its focus was really on telling high-quality standalone stories. These included Christopher Priest's seminal run on Black Panther, the delightfully subversive Ecstatics, and one of my all-time favorite comics, Spider-Man Blue. In comics, Marvel Knights has a proud legacy that consists of some of the best stories ever produced in the medium. The same, can't be said for its filmic equivalent. 2008 is one of the most important years, not just in superhero film, but in filmmaking itself. 2 films would dictate where film was headed over the next decade. Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, and Madagascar, Escape to Africa. No, I'm just playing, y'all. Obviously, I'm talking about The Dark Knight and Iron Man. Both films completely upended expectations about what a superhero film could be. But The Dark Knight had a serious, thematically dense take on the genre. I remember upon release, the phrase I most often heard of regarding the movie was that it felt like an actual movie. And that's because while the genre started strong with X2, Blade 2, and Spider-Man 2 by 2008, it was beginning to feel like the plots were really just excuses to get to some superpowered hand-throwing. Similarly, while Iron Man has somewhat of a lighter tone, it is a character-driven movie to its core, perhaps the most character-driven superhero movie. Tony Stark is not the same person at the end of the film as he was at the beginning, and he managed all that growth in a cave
with a bunch of scraps!
While Marvel was busy establishing the MCU, there were still vestiges of its mid-budget past. Remember that Punisher sequel I was telling you about? Well, now it's a reboot. After Thomas Jane left, director Lexi Alexander recast Ray Stevenson into the titular role. It entered production in 2007, and in December 2008, Punisher Warzone was released into theaters, thus launching the Marvel Knights film banner. Marvel Knights in film was intended to be a way to produce some of the more obscure and darker characters in Marvel's library. Punisher Warzone was the lowest grossing superhero movie of 2008, and I believe it is one of the lowest grossing superhero movies of all time. It grossed only $10 million against a $35 million budget, and its critical reception was abysmal at the time. That said, as the years have gone on, it's grown somewhat of a fan base that I happen to be included in. Punisher Warzone was heavily influenced by the Punisher Max comics, and I think it is one of the most comic book movies to ever comic book movie. This was especially notable for a movie in 2008 because in this era, most movies were trying to tamp down their comic book origins, but Punisher Warzone wore those proudly on its sleeve. It's absurdly hyper-violent, has visual style to spare, and it's both a throwback to a classical era of action filmmaking, as well as a celebration of a particular era of Punisher comics. Ray Stevenson, rest in peace King, does a damn fine job as Frank Castle, and Dominic West just goes for it as Jigsaw. Warzone is easily the grimiest superhero movie, and if you've learned anything from Horror Month, I love me some grimy. The movie is definitely an acquired taste and is far removed from the intellectual highs of The Dark Knight and the propulsive fun of Iron Man. Part of the reason it failed is that it wasn't particularly well marketed, and it wasn't clear if it was a sequel to the 2004 Punisher movie. I didn't even see the movie in theaters because A, I really dug the 04 entry and I wasn't really keen on replacing Thomas Jane with a new guy, and B, the reviews were trash. It wasn't until years after the fact that I finally gave the movie a watch and found that it was one of the hidden gems in the genre. Had the movie done well, we definitely would have got more Warzone movies, but perhaps we would have also seen more movies developed under the Marvel Knights umbrella. As it stood, Marvel continued its work building the MCU, and it seemed like Marvel Knights was just gonna be a one-and-done thing. At least, that was until 2012. So I ain't even gonna front. The more I heard about Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, the more excited I got for it as it got closer to release. You had David Goyer on the script, writer of all three Blades, Batman Begins, and he helped with the story on The Dark Knight. You had Nick Cage returning as Ghost Rider, and most importantly, you had Neville Dean Taylor on board to direct. Mark Neville Dean and Brian Taylor rose to the moment in the mid-2000s. With their Crank films, they quickly established themselves as some of the most balls-out, over-the-top action filmmakers to be working in the genre at the time. Their movies didn't feel like anything else in the game and operated on such a delightfully insane wavelength that I could definitely get down with. When they were announced to direct Ghost Rider, it made all the sense in the world to me. With them on board, Ghost Rider 2 was going to be the gonzo, batshit crazy, balls-to-the-wall action horror extravaganza the first one should have been. It wasn't. Watching Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance is like watching a basketball player continually pump fake and never take the shot. It is the Ben Simmons of superhero movies. You can see the potential, but it just refuses to deliver on it. It starts solid. You got Idris Elba here as Moreau, and he's protecting the son of the devil, and the devil and his men want to take the son back so that the devil can transfer his soul into a young body. They get into this really fun car chase / shootout, and then after all the dust is settled, Moreau goes to find Johnny Blaze, aka the Ghost Rider. And after this really fun start, the movie just gets into this weird start and stop rhythm. I mean, there's moments where Nick Cage is just fully locked in, but the material just isn't giving him enough to work with. The set pieces start strong, too. They culminate in this moment where Ghost Rider transmutes a massive excavator into a death trap fueled by hellfire. This sequence is unabashedly awesome. There's just this slight problem in that it happens so early in the second act and nothing else in the movie even comes close to it. It gets a little hard to become invested in the bog standard car chase that closes out the movie when I saw a goddamn giant excavator get ghost ridden. I did see this one in theaters, in 3D no less, and I left utterly disappointed. I saw it for free because I was working at a movie theater for college, but I still wanted my money back. Spirit of Vengeance was released in February 2012, and it got terrible reviews and did okay at the box office, making $132 million against a budget between $50 to $75 million. And here's the thing, even if Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance was a banger, I'm not sure it would have succeeded in 2012. At that point, Marvel was 4 years into building the MCU, and only 3 months from that experiment paying off in a big way with the first Avengers movie. Audiences had come to expect their superhero movies to operate a certain way, and good or bad, Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance was going to subvert those expectations. And we've all seen just how chill fanboys are when their expectations are subverted. As it stands, Marvel Knights was a failed, short-lived experiment, and that kind of makes me sad. One of the biggest complaints about our current crop of superhero films is just how homogenized it's all started to feel. Say what you will about Warzone and Spirit of Vengeance, but they certainly don't feel like any other superhero film in the genre. They make strong, interesting choices. Well, Warzone does. Spirit of Vengeance could afford to take a few more bold swings. And while the Marvel Knights imprint faded away, the spirit of it didn't quite die out. The Marvel Netflix shows honestly felt like the spiritual successor to the imprint. Daredevil, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones were the darker, more mature takes on the genre that the imprint was designed to cultivate. I mean, yeah, there was also Iron Fist,
But we don't talk about that.
Given how massive Marvel's become over the last decade, I would love to see the Marvel Knights imprint revived to make space for the more darker or obscure characters that may not make sense for the MCU at large. I definitely think a show like Moon Knight could have really benefited from being clearly segmented away from the larger MCU. Marvel seems to be in a never-ending spiral of mid, and I think something like Marvel Knights could be just the thing to reinvigorate interest in the genre beyond die-hard stans and children. So with that, I will see you next week when I take a look at the current state of Marvel Studios and how it has a surprising amount in common with current day Call of Duty. Later.